What's going down, beautiful APUSH people? Today we're taking a look at the Great Depression and, even more importantly, the New Deal. So in 1932, there is an election for the presidency, and the Republican Party is running Herbert Hoover. He's running for a second term. He had the unfortunate luck of being the president when the stock market crashes in October 1929. And for the early part of the Depression, Hoover favored rugged individualism. He did not want the federal government to give direct relief. He does eventually support the Reconstruction Finance Corporation based on a trickle-down theory of economics. And the Democrats, though, pick Franklin Roosevelt. He promises the American people a New Deal. There is no clear plan laid out. No one exactly knows, nor does he, what he's going to do if elected. But in 1932, the unemployment rate is 25%, and there was a growing frustration with the limited response under Hoover and the federal government's failure to address the needs of the American people. And this brings Franklin Roosevelt the victory. So who is this guy Franklin Roosevelt, FDR? Roosevelt comes from a wealthy, privileged family. He is a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He came up in New York politics. He was the governor of New York in 1928. But important to keep in mind is before that occurred, polio had left Roosevelt paralyzed from the waist down, and he could not walk unaided. He needed braces and crutches, and very often in private he used a wheelchair. It's important you also know about Eleanor Roosevelt, the wifey. She will recreate the position of First Lady. She's a very active First Lady, and she is going to be a very vocal advocate for various underserved groups, including African Americans and women. Roosevelt is not going to come up with his policies on his own. In fact, there were a group of advisors, very diverse group of people known as the Brain Trust, and many of these were very intelligent university professors who will help him as he develops his New Deal programs. And as you could see, Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins is one of these members of his cabinet and will be the first woman in the presidential cabinet. Now, what is this New Deal? Well, it's important to keep in mind it was not an organized or pre-planned set of programs. A lot of it was based upon experimentation. And in effect, the New Deal is nothing more than the laws and programs and agencies created by the federal government. And what made the New Deal so popular amongst many Americans was its willingness to experiment. The New Deal is characterized by the 3 R's. Make sure you know these: relief for the people who are struggling from the impact of the Great Depression, recovery to get the economy back on track, and then reform so that this economic crisis would never happen again. Roosevelt takes office in March of 1933. At his inauguration, he famously says, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The New Deal is going to be oftentimes referred to as the alphabet agencies because the programs are going to be known by their various letters. And Roosevelt is going to use the power of the radio. He's going to give many fireside chats where he uses the radio to communicate directly to the American people. And upon taking office, you have this period known as the first 100 days. This starts on March 4th, 1933. Congress, at the request of President Roosevelt, passed a huge number of laws designed to deal with the Great Depression. More laws than in any other period in Congress's history. And one of the first areas that Roosevelt wants to address is the area of banking and finance. In fact, well into 1933, many banks were failing. Depositors had no trust in the banks, and they were quickly withdrawing their funds, causing thousands of banks to fail. So in March of 1933, Roosevelt wants to stop this panic, and he calls for a bank holiday. He wants to close the banks and restore the confidence of the American people. He explains his actions in the fireside chat on March 12th in 1933, and Congress passes the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which basically said only banks that were financially stable could reopen. So the government is going to check them, and once they're deemed stable, they would be allowed to reopen. Another law passed in the first 100 days dealing with finance and banking is the Glass-Steagall Act. This is going to be intended to regulate banks. In fact, it restricted how banks could invest a customer's deposits. And the intention of this is to stop that speculation that banks were taking part in the 1920s. Glass-Steagall Act also establishes the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, more commonly known as FDIC, which says that banks that belong to FDIC, the deposits made would be insured, and up to $2,500 back in 1933 is guaranteed by the federal government. And later on in the New Deal, another law is passed called the Securities and Exchange Commission, where the government would regulate the stock market. And it's really intended to stop that speculation that led to the crash. The government would watch over the stock market, they would audit, and hopefully eliminate fraud. Another part of the first 100 days was intended to deal with the unemployment problem and provide relief. In 1933, millions of people remained unemployed, roughly 25%. And the New Deal created jobs to provide relief to the unemployed. And the idea was, there was the hope that this job creation would provide relief and also lead to recovery. As people had some money in their pocket, they would start spending it and the economy would jumpstart. So during the first 100 days, you get the Federal Emergency Relief Act. This is headed by Harry Hopkins, and the federal government gave money to states and local governments so that they could provide relief services, such as running of soup kitchens. Another program is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This program employed jobless men, young men, in reforestation projects, park maintenance, and other kind of conservation roles. These young men would live on government-run camps, and the idea would be they would be doing these important jobs while also sending money home to their families. And then you also have the PWA, the Public Works Administration, in which federal money would be sent to state and local government for public works projects. So this money would be used to build things like roads, bridges, dams, and other public works. Another aspect of the first 100 days is industrial and agricultural recovery. Remember, one of the big problems was overproduction. To deal with this, the National Recovery Act, the NRA, was created, headed by Hugh Johnson, and its job was, one, to produce industrial recovery, and two, to allow for fair wages and hours for workers. To do this, the federal government and business drafted codes for industries. And these codes, for example, would set production limits so they could limit the possibility of overproduction. There would be codes for wages and hours worked. And there was a special Section 7A in the NRA which allowed workers to form unions. So no more yellow dog contracts, and this is one of the first instances of the federal government guaranteeing the rights of workers to form and join unions. Another important program deals with agriculture. This is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. This paid farmers to cut production. So you want to kind of limit production so that prices could increase, and the government would pay farmers. Farmers would receive subsidies, payments in return for cutting production. So both the NRA and the AAA are trying to stimulate recovery in the economy. It's important to note, we're going to cover this in just a moment, both of these acts will be ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Keep in mind, there was also something called the Dust Bowl going on at this time. Horrible drought in the 1930s added to the farmers' problems on the Great Plains. And you have a number of states, such as Oklahoma, having these severe dust storms known as the Dust Bowl. And really, this is the result of overuse of the land and high winds causing these dust storms, and thousands of Okies, as they were derogatorily called, fled to places like California looking for work and a fresh start. And this is documented in the famous book, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. He talks about one family's journey from Oklahoma trying to start over. Another program in the first 100 days you should know about is the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, and this is really a government agency which built dams, electric power plants, and attempted to control flooding and erosion in this Tennessee Valley area. And it's, as you can see on the map, it's not just in Tennessee, but a whole area of the country that was very poor and without electricity. And this is a huge change from previous policies, since the TVA was the federal government helping develop a region and selling electricity at very reduced rates. And this TVA gave thousands of people jobs and developed this poor region by providing hydroelectric power. It's important to note that in the first couple years of the New Deal, the primary focus was on recovery. And there was some success. The unemployment rate was dropping. There was some recovery taking place in some industries, but there still needed to be more done. And starting in 1935, the second New Deal goes further with reform and direct relief. And you can really see that with the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. The WPA spent billions of dollars. The federal government is employing millions of unemployed workers. And under the WPA, instead of unemployed people getting relief from the local and state government, this time it's the federal government, and workers are building roads, bridges, and other public works projects. The WPA also employs artists, writers, painters, actors, photographers under sub-programs such as the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Arts Project, and even the National Youth Administration for young people. Another program under the second New Deal is the Resettlement Administration. This provided assistance, really loans to sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and other small farmers that were left out of assistance in the first New Deal. And if you recall, the AAA actually paid farmers to take land out of production, and this hurt non-land owning farmers. So the Resettlement Administration seeks to address the plight of those individuals. One of the most important programs of the New Deal is going to be Social Security. And the Social Security Act of 1935 would have the greatest impact on future generations. Reason being, the Social Security Act established the principle of federal responsibility for social welfare. Here's what it does. Money would be taken out from the payroll of employee and employers, and people over the age of 65 and above would receive money pensions upon retirement. Under Social Security, others were eligible for assistance, such as mothers with dependent children, unemployment insurance for those individuals who lost their jobs, or for the disabled. And this is a huge program still around today, and it provides a safety net for those individuals who need assistance. Another important program of the second New Deal is the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act guaranteed the rights of organized labor. It protected the right to join a union and to bargain collectively. And this is a huge change because it is the first time that the federal government is protecting the rights of workers to form unions. It creates the National Labor Relations Board to enforce the labor laws, and what you're going to see is after 1935 a huge boost to the labor movement. You're going to have the rise of the CIO under John L. Lewis. You're going to have the sit-down strikes in General Motors, and labor union membership is going to increase. There were challenges to the New Deal. And it's important to note that by 1936, the New Deal did improve the economy, but it still remained unstable. In spite of these limitations to the New Deal, Roosevelt remained enormously popular. He easily crushes Alfred Landon in the election of 1936, but still there were critics of Roosevelt and the New Deal. One of the most vocal critics were conservatives and business owners. They tended to dislike Roosevelt's New Deal programs. A couple reasons why they did not like the increase of government regulation and the increase in the size of the federal government, and they were very critical of deficit spending. For Roosevelt and his brain trust, they justified these policies because they were following the policies of British economist John Maynard Keynes. And Keynesian economics says deficit spending was needed during times of economic crisis to stimulate economic growth. So you're going to jumpstart the economy by spending money and running these deficits. There were some liberal critics of the New Deal. They felt that the New Deal was not doing enough for minority communities and the poor. And you get the rise of various demagogues who are challenging Roosevelt and the New Deal. Two of the big ones is Dr. Francis Townsend. Actually, before the Social Security Act is passed, Townsend's plan said that every person over the age of 60 would receive $200 a month, and that money would have to be spent immediately, which would then stimulate the economy while also providing assistance for the elderly. And the other big guy is the senator from Louisiana, Huey Long, who advocated for the program Share Our Wealth. This program slogan was Every Man a King, and what it would do was tax the wealth and give that money to the poor. So it was a redistribution of money, and he had a lot of followers, but unfortunately for Long, he will be assassinated. In Roosevelt's mind, one of the biggest threats to his New Deal was the Supreme Court. So a little background on the court packing plan. Remember, the Supreme Court ruled two key New Deal programs unconstitutional. They also ruled some others, but the two that you should know about is the National Recovery Act, ruled unconstitutional in 1935, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And Roosevelt decides that he is going to propose a plan that would allow him to appoint additional judges. And under his plan, for every judge over the age of 70, Roosevelt would be able to appoint an additional judge. So the Supreme Court would go from 9 to 15 judges. Critics accuse him of trying to pack the court. This is seen as his court packing plan because it's very clear Roosevelt wants to put people in the Supreme Court who will support his New Deal policies. There's a huge amount of opposition from both Republicans and Democrats as they see Roosevelt's court packing plan as an assault on the principle of checks and balances. And Roosevelt suffers a rare political defeat over this issue of the Supreme Court. And finally, some impacts that are important to know about. One is the change that happens politically. The New Deal Democratic coalition of farmers, urban immigrants, union members, African Americans, and women. The Democratic Party gets a lot of support because of its New Deal programs from these different groups. And key is the change of voting patterns amongst African Americans. All the way back until Lincoln, African Americans tended to support the Republican Party. This changes under Franklin Roosevelt because of his New Deal policies. The New Deal established the federal responsibility for society. It created the safety net, the welfare state. And in spite of the numerous programs, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. It would not be until World War II that the Great Depression will finally end. But it does provide huge amount of relief to numerous people throughout the 1930s. There continues to be a debate about deficit spending and the creation of the welfare state and the growth of the federal government, so it opens up these discussions that will not go away. In fact, in 1937, a recession takes place, the so-called Roosevelt recession, when reduced government spending on public works and reduction in relief programs causes the economy to decline. And remember the idea of Keynesian economics, the government spending helps promote economic growth. Following the recession in 1937, Roosevelt continues the spending and that boosts the economy back up. And it's important to note that the New Deal is going to have a limited impact on racial and gender issues. Roosevelt, for example, did nothing on the very huge problem of lynching, and the reason being is he did not want to jeopardize support for his New Deal programs by coming out in favor of an anti-lynching law. He knew if he did that, he would lose the support among Southern Democrats. So when it came to issues of civil rights, Roosevelt was a Alright, hopefully we got you ready for this next test. If the video helped you out at all, click like. If you haven't done so, subscribe. Tell all your classmates to do the same. And if you have any questions, post a comment in the comment box. Have a beautiful day. Peace. Active First Lady, and she is going to be a very vocal advocate for various underserved groups, including African Americans and women. Roosevelt is not going to come up with his policies on his own. In fact, there were a group of advisors, very diverse group of people known as the Brain Trust, and many of these were very intelligent university professors who will help him as he develops his New Deal programs. And as you could see, Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins is one of these members of his cabinet and will be the first woman in the presidential cabinet. Now, what is this New Deal? Well, it's important to keep in mind it was not an organized or pre-planned set of programs. A lot of it was based upon experimentation. And in effect, the New Deal is nothing more than the laws and programs and agencies created by the federal government. And what made the New Deal so popular amongst many Americans was its willingness to experiment. The New Deal is characterized by the 3 R's. Make sure you know these: relief for the people who are struggling from the impact of the Great Depression, recovery to get the economy back on track, and then reform so that this economic crisis would never be a victory. So who is this guy Franklin Roosevelt, FDR? Roosevelt comes from a wealthy, privileged family. He is a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He came up in New York politics. He was the governor of New York in 1928. But important to keep in mind is before that occurred, polio had left Roosevelt paralyzed from the waist down, and he could not walk unaided. He needed braces and crutches, and very often in private he used a wheelchair. It's important you also know about Eleanor Roosevelt, the wifey. She will recreate the position of First Lady. She's eventually support the Reconstruction Finance Corporation based on a trickle-down theory of economics. And the Democrats, though, pick Franklin Roosevelt. He promises the American people a New Deal. There is no clear plan laid out. No one exactly knows, nor does he, what he's going to do if elected. But in 1932, the unemployment rate is 25%, and there was a growing frustration with the limited response under Hoover and the federal government's failure to address the needs of the American people. And this brings Franklin Roosevelt. What's going down, beautiful APUSH people? Today we're taking a look at the Great Depression and, even more importantly, the New Deal. So in 1932, there is an election for the presidency, and the Republican Party is running Herbert Hoover. He's running for a second term. He had the unfortunate luck of being the president when the stock market crashes in October 1929. And for the early part of the Depression, Hoover favored rugged individualism. He did not want the federal government to give direct relief. He does